So I've been working on a new Mosaic knit cowl pattern, and this one is worked in the round, which is great because it's totally seamless, so there's no sewing to do at the end. But before I finished it off, I thought it might be quite helpful just to pass on a few tips about knitting in the round. If you haven't done any mosaic knitting before, then I would recommend having a look at our beginners mosaic knitting tutorial, and I'll put a link to that above. If you haven't worked in the round before, we also have a tutorial for joining in the round, which might be quite useful, so that you can learn how to start a project like this. So this isn't going to be a full tutorial. I'm just going to talk a little bit about changing colours, stitch markers, working in stockinette, working in garter stitch in the round, slip stitches, and also how to work charts in the round as well. So let's get started. As with working mosaic knitting flat, when you're working in the round, again you usually do 2 rounds in one colour and then you switch to the next colour. So when you get to the end of a round, which is where your stitch marker is, what I like to do is take the yarn that I've been working with, move it over to the left, over the top of my new yarn, bring my new yarn to the right. Then with my left hand, I just tension the old yarn, so the one I've just finished with, just tension it with my left finger, and that's all I'm going to do. I'm not going to knit with it or anything, I'm just keeping it tight. And then the new yarn will come underneath and around, and what I need to do is just tension the new yarn as well. So don't pull it tight because you'll end up gathering the stitches, so you're just taking any slack out of it, not pulling it tight, just taking the slack out of it. And then I'm just going to knit or slip, whatever the pattern says, first couple of stitches, and then I can drop the old colour and leave that at the left. And then again, when I come to the end of 2 rounds with this colour, I will take it over the top, bring the new yarn underneath and round, and again tension with this one, take the slack out of this one and just knit. And that's the best way to do it. So you can see here where the join is, there's no pulling, there's no tightness, and there's also no gaps. So even though you're kind of knitting off centre, you're knitting off side because your row is ending 2 rows above where you started it, because you're tightening them, it's joining them up. So here you can't even really see where the join is. So that's how I do it, so I hope that's helpful. When you're working in the round, it's really important to use a stitch marker to represent the beginning of the round, so that you know where your start and end is. You can use a normal stitch marker that you would put onto the needle, that's fine, there's no problem with that, but you might find that because it's at the point where you're changing yarn colours, that you could end up with a slightly laddered effect, or your yarns might get a little bit twisted around it. So what I like to do is use one of the safety pin type removable stitch markers, and every few rounds I'll just move that up so that I can easily see which is the first stitch of my round. It's also really good if you're working in something that is reversible, because then you can see which is the right side so that you don't end up knitting the wrong way. So working stocking stitch in the round is really easy because you are basically just knitting every single stitch. So you're doing the 2 round repeat as you normally do in mosaic knitting. So you knit the first round and you knit the second round. So when we come to our slip stitches, our yarn's already at the back because it's a knit stitch, so we can simply just slip. So if we've got stocking stitch, we're just knitting and slipping, so it's very fast, very easy. If you want to do garter stitch in the round, you have to knit your first round and then purl on the second round. So you have to remember to bring your yarn between the needles, not over the top. And then we'll just purl this second round. And now we've come to a slip stitch, so we have to remember to put our yarn back between the needles before we're slipping the stitch. And it's as easy as that for stockinette and garter stitch. Here's the chart that I've been working on for this cowl. So as you can see, all the round numbers are at the right hand side, because when you're working in the round, you're always working along this way. When you work flat, you will work along that way and then come back this way. But in the round, you always start the chart from the right hand side. Now when I'm writing charts, I like to do for mosaic charts, I like to do one row of squares for 2 rounds. This gives you a better visual image of what the pattern will look like. I find if you do one row of squares for each row that you're knitting, you end up with quite an elongated pattern. Also, most of the time, if it's in stockinette, the first row and second row will be identical, so there isn't really a need to do separate chart rows for each round that you're knitting. So you'll be able to tell from the row numbers at the right hand side. So you can see mine go 1, 3, 5, 7, so they're jumping up by 2 rows each time, so you can tell that each one of these rows on the chart represents 2 rounds. Now at the top in the key you will see it says round 1 and round 2. So the symbols here tell you what to do on the first round and what to do on the second round. So for example, the little dot here, if we look at the top, on the first round I'm going to knit these stitches, but then on the second round I'm going to purl them. And the slip stitches are always slipped with the yarn in the back. So you'll quite often get repeats as well in mosaic knitting charts. So here you can see it's bordered by a darker line. So once you get to the top, it tells you there to repeat rows 7 to 53, and those are within the darker box there. At the side here you get the yarn reference A or B, so when that's written out in the pattern you should be able to follow whether you should be using yarn A or yarn B. Now just because the yarn A is a darker shade and B is a lighter shade doesn't mean that you have to do that within your piece of knitting. Here I've actually done it the other way around because I wanted to see how it would look sort of inverted. So when you're picking your colours, it doesn't have to be that A is dark and B is light. So on mosaic knitting charts, the shaded stitches give you a visual representation of the pattern, but they don't actually represent what stitch you need to use. So as with knitting flat, you need to look at the key at the top for the symbol within the box rather than what colour the actual box is. So I hope you enjoyed this video and have learned something about mosaic knitting in the round. If there is anything else that you want to know, if you've got any questions, please leave comments below and I'll do my best to answer any queries that you might have.